Okay, so before we dive into the actual content of Chapter 2, which focuses on research methods, there's one more thing I want to take some time to talk about from Chapter 1. It is in the section where she talks about the general gang literature, overall, not specific to women. There's some information there that you see on this slide that you need to know, and you can either pause this video to kind of take a better look at each of these, or you can pull up the PDF version of the slides that contains the same information. What I wanted to spend some time talking about is how gangs are formed, different factors that are involved in the formation of gangs. Now, the factors that lead to gang formation are not factors that cause individual people to join gangs. So those two things are different. Make sure that you keep that in mind and don't get those confused. When gang scholars trace the history of gangs and compare commonalities in those histories, they tend to see a few things. First, they see that they're usually formed independently in individual cities. That means they aren't formed via any franchise model, which would mean that basically gang leaders in one or a few areas, they don't turn to each other and say, we don't have any presence in, southern Iowa, so we need to send somebody to set up shop out there, right? Sometimes you do see that, but pretty much only in very large, very developed, very organized, formally structured criminal organizations. In addition, it's rare to see one single person, a super charismatic leader, let's say, go around a particular area, rounding people up to join a gang like some kind of a Pied Piper. The groups form more independently from existing gangs and through more natural and sort of group means versus one person basically doing all the work. The next commonality relates back to deindustrialization. Gang emergence tends to happen in areas that are blighted and experiencing economic deterioration, including lapses and sort of disappearing or decreased social services, public health centers, for instance, and those that are very racially and ethnically segregated. That's not just an American thing. It took a long time for Europe, for instance, to admit it had a gang issue because they didn't look like American gangs, and they didn't start in prison. Most gangs didn't start in prison. There are some specific ones that are quite well known that did. But a lot of the groups in Europe formed within developed Western and westernized European countries, northern European countries, and this happened once they opened their borders to refugees from war-torn southern and eastern European countries. The people in the countries that the refugees were moving into sort of placed these individuals in camps or, low income housing, essentially, that wasn't that expensive to build, to help them, find a place to live. And they tended to be in fairly isolated areas, where they decided to house these people. And because they were from a different place and had different culture and spoke different language and things of that nature, they faced some prejudice, they faced some discrimination, and that's kind of a recipe for groups coming together to solve problems that they don't trust the dominant group to address, or that the dominant group just won't really address. At least not in a way that takes that group's culture and values into account. Similar situations occurred with the Italian mafia and in America, and even the Polish and Irish immigrants who came to America in the early 1900s. The last commonality that we sometimes see is a bit of a quote-unquote copycat effect, or the copycat model, as Miller refers to it. This refers to groups that came together independently of larger gangs, right? To go back to that first point. They came together in their own neighborhoods, but then they started to learn about and be exposed to larger gangs and gang culture through media and through popular culture. And sometimes those groups then sort of decide to claim affiliation with that larger gang, or sometimes they change their affiliation, try to become part of the larger gang. This happens, but it's more common in the newer quote-unquote gang cities and in areas that haven't experienced the same economic hit from deinstitutionalization and other social factors. So you'll see questions there. Which of the above best fits St. Louis? Well, that's the independent development and deindustrialization commonalities. And for Columbus, there's more of that diffusion of gang culture through media. So it looks a little more like the copycat model. Now we can move into chapter 2, where she lays out all of her research methods. So if you wanted to learn about girls and gangs, and you saw the law enforcement estimates that suggest, not very many girls are in gangs, not very many gang members are girls, are women, how would you go about trying to find these women, right? How would you go about trying to find these girls? How can you go to the source when there are so few, allegedly? And how can you go to the source when the topic itself, being in a gang, is hush-hush because people can get in trouble for being in gangs? What she decided to do was not try to go directly to the source, so to speak, but pull from an existing pool of at-risk girls. So she decided, go seek out local agencies who work with at-risk girls, recruit them to participate in surveys, pretty extensive survey, and ask them questions about what they know about gangs, ask them if they're a member of a gang, and for those that say yes, and for those who can, answer additional questions to sort of prove that they are in a gang, those girls were invited for a follow-up interview, right? That was more in-depth, less structured, more qualitative in style, right? So what are the strengths of her research? Before this, very little was known about gang girls. So that's this is a strength. This study is a strength just for that reason. Secondly, there's the comparative aspect. So she is able to compare gang girls to their at-risk counterparts. She's also comparing two sites, right? St. Louis and Columbus. So we get a lot of rich comparison out of that. She also uses mixed methods, which is always ideal, honestly, if possible. Now, what about limitations? And what about issues with her overall methodological approach and the specific decisions that she made. Here's a pretty good list of the limitations and issues. One thing that students often comment on is the small sample size. And yes, relatively speaking, it's fairly small sample size, although 94 girls participating in an extensive survey, that's pretty decent. And when it comes to the actual qualitative interviews, she's almost at 30 in each site, and 30 is sort of like a gold star sort of number for qualitative interviewing. Basically, the larger your sample size is, especially in qualitative interviewing, the easier it's going to be for you to be able to do an intersectional analysis looking at intersection of race, sex, sexuality, class, etc. The smaller your sample is, the harder it is to do that. And that's true for quantitative research too, of course. Age is another one. These girls, were honestly pretty young. You'll find out more about that in the next chapter, but suffice to say for now that the youngest ones were basically Shanae's age from girlhood, and thus they weren't all that self-aware yet. Just like, there are some things that Shanae seemed to just not really get until she could get older. Same sort of situation here. So they didn't have a lot of deep, insightful comments to make. They had a shorter time being in the gang, so they didn't have as much to talk about as the older girls. Whereas the ones who were more Megan's age, they'd been a part of it longer. They were at least a little bit more mature, so they had more meaningful things to contribute to the overall data. Now, one of the most important limitations here is that all of these girls are ones who have come to attention of authorities, right? They've all basically gotten caught doing something that was delinquent, deviant, problematic in some kind of a way. Now, why does that matter? Well, there has to be some gang girls out there who just haven't gotten caught, right? Maybe those girls who haven't gotten caught are more privileged. Maybe they have more family support. Maybe their gang is not taking as many risks. Maybe they're just not as involved in criminality. We just don't know, and there could be meaningful differences there, but at the same time, maybe there's not. We just don't know. A better explanation for why this may be a problem is that these girls are probably involved in programs, or at least interacting with adults in the facilities that they're at, and their probation officers and things of that nature, who are trying to convince them in some way that gang involvement is wrong, right? Who are defining it in negative ways and trying to illustrate to them the negatives, the risks, all of that sort of thing. So the girls could be in the process of, or maybe they already have gotten there, of defining gang activity in more negative terms. So they're going to be talking more about the negatives, versus the girls maybe who haven't gotten caught, the girls who haven't come to attention of authorities, who may still have some real positive things to say. So all of that can influence your actual data, right? Because it can influence the words that are coming from the participants themselves. Then we also have the issue of some of these girls are institutionalized and run away from the facilities, and she's relying on, being able to go to the facilities, not to be going to these girls where they live or out on the streets somewhere. So if they AWOL like Megan did, then they can just get lost from the sample. And there's some lost data, lost participants there. And then there are some ethical issues and some larger issues, and we'll talk about that and how she tried to overcome them in the next Chapter 2 video.